The morning of the 23rd of October, 1814, was the sort of morning that deceived people into believing the world was ordered and just. The breakfast room at Ashmore Park lay in pale autumn light, and Miss Cecily Vane stood at the sideboard pouring tea she had not been asked to pour, because the parlor maid had twisted her ankle on the back stairs and there was no one else, and Cecily had never in her life stood still while a thing needed doing. She wore a plain gray dress with a white collar that had been laundered so many times the threads had begun to separate at the edge. Her hair was pinned without art. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father's death and the subsequent arrangement by which she served as unpaid companion and occasional secretary to Lady Ashmore, that she was most useful when least noticed. She had been noticed this morning, however, not by Lady Ashmore, who sat at the head of the table reading a letter with an expression of suppressed triumph she did not trouble to suppress entirely. Not by Miss Georgiana Ashmore, Lady Ashmore's niece, who was 17 and beautiful, and currently examining her own reflection in the back of a polished spoon, with the serene confidence of someone who had never once been told she was forgettable. Cecily had been noticed by the tall man who stood in the doorway, still in his riding coat, mud on his boots, a folded paper in his gloved hand, and an expression on his face that she could not read because she had made it a policy not to look at the Earl of Strath for longer than social necessity required. The Earl of Strath, whose name was Edmund Carew, had arrived at Ashmore Park the previous evening, which Cecily knew because she had been the one to arrange his room, to direct the footman, and to inform Lady Ashmore with appropriate neutrality that his lordship's carriage had been seen on the South Drive. She knew he was here because his family's solicitor had sent word a fortnight ago regarding an arrangement that Lady Ashmore had discussed, in fragments, over the preceding month, a match between the Earl and Georgiana, which would settle Georgiana's future agreeably and repair a long-standing debt of connection between the two families that had roots, so Lady Ashmore said, in decisions made before either young person was born. What Cecily knew about the Earl of Strath, that the room did not know she knew, was this. He had written 2 letters. The first had arrived 3 weeks ago, addressed to Lady Ashmore, and Cecily had carried it upstairs and set it on the escritoire in the morning room without reading it, because she did not read letters addressed to other people. That was the letter Lady Ashmore held now, rereading with her expression of satisfaction, its seal already broken. The second had arrived 6 days ago, addressed to Cecily herself, which was unusual enough that she had stood in the cold passage outside the kitchen, holding it for a full minute before opening it. It was brief. It asked in formal and careful language whether Miss Vane would do him the honor of walking with him in the East Garden on the morning of his arrival, at 8 o'clock, if she was willing and if her duties permitted it. It did not explain itself. It signed itself Edmund Carew, without the title. She had read it twice, put it in the pocket of her gray dress, and then taken it out again, and read it a third time. She had not replied, because she did not know how, and because she was almost certain it had been sent in error. She was still almost certain of this. She watched him now across the breakfast room, saw the moment his eyes found her at the sideboard, saw the slight adjustment of his jaw, a thing he controlled immediately. "Good morning, my lord," she said, and poured his tea without being asked, because it needed to be done, and she was the one there to do it. He said, "Good morning, Miss Vane," and his voice was low and level, and Lady Ashmore looked up from her letter. If you have ever stood in a room where a letter has decided something about you without your knowledge, stay close. This story is for you. The arrangement had been the subject of 6 months of careful negotiation between Lady Ashmore and the late Earl's solicitor, a man named Fielding who had a habit of speaking about people as though they were properties to be assessed and transferred. What Cecily understood of it was this: Georgiana was 19, pretty, and in want of a husband. The Earl of Strath was 31, solvent, and in want of an heir. Lady Ashmore held the connection between them to be ideal and had spent considerable effort cultivating it in correspondence. She had also spent considerable effort ensuring that Cecily's role in that correspondence remained administrative. Cecily drafted letters. She copied fare. She organized documents. She did not inject herself into the content. What she had not known, until the morning the Earl's second letter arrived in the kitchen passage, was that the Earl had injected her into the content regardless. She had finally understood this 6 days ago, standing in her small room above the servants' stair, reading his brief, careful note. He wrote that he had heard her read aloud to Mrs. Platt, the housekeeper. During the woman's recent illness with a chest cold, standing in the passage outside the kitchen, because the housekeeper was embarrassed to be read to, and Cecily had found a way to make it feel like an accident. He wrote that he had heard her refuse, on 2 occasions over the preceding fortnight, to sign her name to letters she had drafted but not authored, because the letters said things she could not personally vouch for. He wrote that he had been in the house 3 times over the summer on matters of business with Lady Ashmore's steward, and that on each occasion he had observed something that he could not name in a letter, but wished to discuss in person, if she would allow it, in the East Garden, at 8 o'clock, on the morning of the 23rd. He had not written that he was coming to Ashmore Park to make an offer of marriage to Georgiana Ashmore. Cecily knew it, however, because she had typed the letter he sent to Lady Ashmore, confirming his intentions and the date of his proposed visit, and she had done it as she did everything. Carefully, without adding herself to it, without inflecting the page. She had sat with that letter for longer than the transcription required. The date of the proposed visit and the paragraph of polite expectation regarding Miss Ashmore were both entirely legible and entirely clear. She had read them, and then she had read his brief note again, the one in the kitchen passage, the one signed without the title. And she had thought about 2 things that could be simultaneously true, without explaining each other. That a man could be coming to a house to make a reasonable and sensible offer to a perfectly good young woman, and that the same man could have also written a note to someone else entirely. For reasons that the note did not fully explain and that she could not fully account for, she had folded the letter he sent her and put it in the pocket of her gray dress and walked back to the breakfast room to set the table. She had not gone to the East Garden at 8 o'clock. She told herself she had been needed elsewhere. She told herself it was an error in addressing. She told herself that a woman in her position could not afford the kind of misunderstanding that resulted from taking seriously a letter that had probably been meant for someone else. The Ashmore Park house party had included 2 other single women in the days prior, a Mrs. Fairford and her daughter, both of whom had since departed. It was possible. She told herself it was possible. She did not entirely believe herself. She had spent the interval since the letter's arrival in the very particular effort of a practical woman forcing a thing she did not want to examine back below the level of examination. The letter had a weight to it that was disproportionate to its length. She had folded it very small and placed it inside a book she was in the middle of reading. And the book had sat on her bedside table every night for 6 days with the letter inside it. And she had not opened the book again. This was not, she knew, the behavior of a woman who believed the letter had been misdirected. It was the behavior of a woman who could not afford to believe it had not been, and who was making the only choice available to her given the circumstances, which was to hold very still and let the matter resolve itself into something she did not have to act upon. The difficulty with him was that he had a way of being still when other people moved that made him very difficult to ignore. He was not cold, exactly, though Lady Ashmore spoke of him as reserved, which in her vocabulary meant the same thing. He was contained. He occupied a room with the quiet patience of a man who had learned at considerable cost that his reactions were watched and used, and who had decided some time ago to give the watchers as little as possible. His face was strong-featured, tanned from more time outdoors than his station strictly required. His dark hair touched with early gray at the temples that Cecily had noticed and refused to catalogue. He had a scar at the edge of his right jaw that curved toward his chin, pale against his skin. Something old. She had noticed that too. She had noticed it in July when he came to speak to the steward. And she had been in the library returning a volume, and he had stood at the window across the hall, and she had noted the scar, and then set the volume down firmly on the wrong shelf, and made herself leave. The other thing she knew about the Earl, which she knew because she had been the one to receive the solicitor's documents and organize them for Lady Ashmore, was that 3 years ago his wife had died in childbirth, along with the child. The solicitor's letter had referenced this with the brisk bureaucratic efficiency of a man for whom death was paperwork, and Cecily had sat with the document for a moment longer than necessary before adding it to the file. She had not spoken of it. She had simply known it, the way she knew all the things that passed through the house without attaching her name to any of them. She understood now, pouring his tea in the October morning light, why he was contained. "You will want to see the East Garden," Lady Ashmore said to Georgiana, not looking up from her letter, "before the frost takes the roses. Miss Vane, take Georgiana to the garden after breakfast." "Of course," Cecily said. "My lord, I hope your ride was comfortable," Lady Ashmore said to the Earl. "Thank you," he said. He had not yet sat down. He was looking at the letter in his hand, and Cecily, who had not meant to look at him again, looked at him, and saw that the letter he held was not the one she thought it was. It was small, and the paper was a particular pale blue, and she recognized it because she had bought that paper herself at a small stationer's in the village 3 weeks ago for the writing of personal notes. The supply was kept in the top drawer of the escritoire in the morning room. She had used 4 sheets. She had written 3 notes, all of which she had sent. The 4th sheet had remained in the drawer. The letter the Earl of Strath was holding was written on paper from the top drawer of the morning room escritoire. She could see the color from where she stood. She had stood very still in the October morning light and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the window. The parlor maid's name was Agnes. She had been at Ashmore Park for 11 months. She was small and quick, and she had, Cecily had noticed without paying it too much attention, a habit of lingering near the morning room in the evenings when the correspondence was done. Cecily set down the teapot. She said very carefully to Lady Ashmore, "Forgive me. I believe I should check on Agnes's ankle. She took a fall this morning." "The ankle can wait," Lady Ashmore said. "Georgiana, finish your toast." Cecily sat down. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and she thought very carefully. The Earl of Strath had asked her 6 days ago to meet him in the East Garden. She had not replied. She had not gone. He had arrived anyway, and he was holding a letter written on her paper in his gloved hand, and his expression was the most complicated thing she had seen on a human face in 2 years of watching faces carefully. Cecily understood, by the time she reached the bottom of her teacup, what had happened. Agnes had found the Earl's letter to Cecily, or had found Cecily's unwritten reply, or had simply known what she knew about the arrangement and had made a decision in the small hours of the previous night with a sheet of pale blue paper and a pen borrowed from the morning room, and had sent a response to the Earl that Cecily had not written. She did not yet know what the response said. She did not need to know what it said to know that this was the case. She was very good at reading rooms, and the room she was sitting in had the texture of something that had already been decided without her. She would not have said she was afraid. She was not in the habit of naming her states. She was aware of a pressure in her chest and a very unusual stillness in her hands, and a clarity of attention that tended to arrive when something was about to require careful management. If you are wondering what the letter said, Cecily was wondering the same thing. Hold on just a little longer. The East Garden in October had been stripped by the first frost to bare-stemmed roses and stone paths, and a stone bench at the far end near the wall, beside a late lavender that had not yet entirely given up. The light was sharp and thin, and the ground had not yet dried from the morning's damp. Cecily walked here because Lady Ashmore had said to bring Georgiana, and Georgiana had remained inside upon discovering a speck of mud on her half-boot. And so Cecily walked alone, which was what she had wanted without letting herself want it. She heard him behind her before she heard his steps. That was not logical, and she noted it without being able to explain it. "Miss Vane," he said. She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She gave herself the length of one breath to compose her face, and then she turned. He was still holding the letter. The gloves were gone now. He had exchanged the riding coat for a dark blue tailcoat, white cravat, and his expression had the quality of a man who had been very patient for a very long time, and was now at some threshold. "My lord," she said. He held out the letter. She took it. Her fingers did not brush his. She was careful about that. The paper was thin between her fingers, and she opened it, and she read what someone had written on her pale blue paper in a hand that was almost but not quite her own. It said that Miss Cecily Vane would be greatly honored to walk with his lordship on the morning of the 23rd. It said that she had hoped for the occasion to speak plainly. It said in one sentence at the end that made the back of Cecily's throat close that she had thought of little else since his last visit. She read it twice. She folded it. "I did not write this," she said. The pause that followed was very brief. "I know," he said. The October light moved slightly. She kept her eyes on the folded paper in her hands. "How long have you known?" "Since the handwriting. I had seen your hand on the steward's documents. There are small differences." His voice was level. It was always level. She had noticed, over months of incidental contact, that his voice did not change much between calm and distress. This made it very difficult to know what was happening inside it. "I came regardless." She looked up. His face was still. The scar at the jaw was very pale in this light, and his eyes were gray, which she had not let herself confirm until now. "You are here," she said, "to make an offer to Miss Ashmore." "I came to Ashmore Park for that purpose," he said. "Yes?" "Lady Ashmore's intention is quite clear." "It is." He did not add anything. She waited, because she had learned that the spaces after his sentences sometimes contained more than the sentences themselves. "I should return the letter to you," she said. She held it out. He did not take it. "Miss Vane?" he said, and stopped. She waited again. "I heard you tell Lady Ashmore, in September, that the letter she wished you to send to Fielding's office contained a misrepresentation regarding the entail, that you would not sign it until the matter was corrected." "The matter was corrected," she said. "The letter went." "With the correction." "Yes." "She did not dismiss you." "She needed the letter sent correctly." He was silent for a moment. She watched his jaw, which was one of the few places his body sometimes told her what his voice would not. "I am here to make an offer to a young woman I have met twice," he said. on the basis of an arrangement that was made sensible because the debt of connection required settling, and because Fielding told me she was a good sort of girl, and Lady Ashmore's letters were warm and well expressed. Cecily said nothing. Her hands were very still on the folded paper. "Those letters were warm and well expressed," he said, "because you wrote them." The stone path was very even. She watched it. "They were drafted under Lady Ashmore's instruction," she said. "I do not put words into letters that have not been asked for." "I know that," he said. "That is precisely what I know about you." The lavender beside the bench moved slightly in the October air. She did not look at him. She was aware of exactly where he was, which was a problem she had been managing for approximately 7 months without managing it particularly well. "What the arrangement requires of me," he said, "is a choice. Lady Ashmore believes it has already been made. Fielding believes it is a matter of procedure from here. The letter on that paper believes I am here because I have answered a question I was not asked." He stopped. She made herself look up. His face was doing nothing obvious. The patience in it was the kind that had cost something. "I wrote to you," he said, "because I wanted to know whether the thing I thought I had been observing for 7 months was a thing that could be spoken plainly between 2 honest people. I did not write to Miss Ashmore. I have never written to Miss Ashmore. If I were writing to Miss Ashmore, I would write to Lady Ashmore first, and Fielding would arrange the rest, and we would meet in the drawing room under the correct conditions. I wrote to you." "Someone else replied," she said. "Yes." "And you came anyway?" "I told you. Yes." She looked at the folded letter in her hands. She thought about Agnes, who had made a decision in the dark, with someone else's paper and someone else's story, and perhaps her own idea of how things ought to work out, and who had created a situation that was now standing in an October garden requiring Cecily to decide something without any of the groundwork she would have required for a decision of this weight. She was not the kind of woman who made decisions like this. She had not, for 2 years, made any decisions that were not required of her by the practical needs of the household. She had not allowed herself the luxury of considering what she wanted from a situation before determining what the situation needed from her. She looked up at him, at the scar on his jaw and those gray eyes she had not let herself confirm until this morning, and at the patient discipline of a face that had ridden to a house where the wrong letter had invited him. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I have thought about your letter, the one you actually wrote." He was very still. "I did not reply," she said, "because I was certain it was sent in error. I was nearly certain. I am telling you this because you have been honest, and I cannot do otherwise." "You were nearly certain," he said. "Nearly." The pause was different now. "Miss Vane?" he said. "Cecily." Her name in his voice was a thing she had not been prepared for, and she had thought she was prepared for most things. "I have not been in a garden with someone I wish to be in a garden with," he said, "for a long time. I have managed a great many things correctly. I have made sensible decisions. I have read sensible letters. I have arranged sensible meetings in the correct rooms under the correct conditions." His voice was still level. The thing inside it was not. "I would like very much to know whether the woman who refused to sign a letter that contained a misrepresentation is willing to tell me plainly what she wants from this morning." The October light was thin and cold and very clear. "I want," she said slowly, "to know why you turned the portrait in the east study toward the wall." He looked at her. Whatever she had expected him to say, this was not it, and she had not expected anything. "You know about the portrait," he said. "I organize the rooms when you visit. I notice things." A long pause. The lavender moved. "It is my wife," he said. Catherine. She has been there since the house was lent to the steward's office. I did not ask for it to be moved formally because it seemed like a statement. I simply turned it. Because? Because I could not look at it from the desk, he said. And because I did not want to look at it from the desk when I was sitting at the desk trying to concentrate on documents I kept making errors in. Cecily held the folded letter and looked at him. You made errors in the documents, she said. Fielding corrected them. He did not remark on it, which was kind of him. The errors were not there in July, she said. I saw the July documents. No, he said. They were not there in July. She did not ask when they had started. She thought she knew. What she felt was not triumph. She was not someone who felt triumph at other people's vulnerabilities. What she felt was the very specific ache of recognizing something in another person that she had been careful not to recognize in herself, which was the desire to be known by someone who had chosen to look rather than been asked to. I should tell you, she said, that my father left almost nothing, that I am here because I had no other position available, and Lady Ashmore's distant connection to my family made this one possible, that I have no portion, no connections of value, and that if you make an offer to Georgiana Ashmore this morning, you will satisfy Lady Ashmore and Fielding and the long-standing debt of connection entirely, and there will be no difficulty at all. He was quiet for a moment. That is a great deal of information to give someone you believe is about to make an offer to someone else, he said. I am being honest. You are warning me. I am giving you the information that is relevant. Then I will give you information that is relevant, he said. He was quiet for a moment first, as though assembling it, which she had come to understand was characteristic. He did not speak before he was ready to mean what he said. I made an arrangement because arrangements are what I knew how to make after Catherine. I wrote to you because I did not know how to write to you, and I wrote anyway because I had watched you refuse to falsify a document, and I thought, if I could speak to that woman honestly, I would know what I was looking at. I came to this garden this morning because a letter told me you had thought of little else, and I knew you had not written the letter, and I came anyway because I needed to know whether the woman who had not written it had thought it. The stone path, the bare roses, the thin autumn light. I thought it, she said. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it. His hand, bare, offered in the cold October air. She put hers in it. His fingers closed around hers, careful, certain, and warm. Then I would like to speak to Lady Ashmore, he said, and I would like you to be present when I do. The drawing room at Ashmore Park was arranged, as it always was when Lady Ashmore meant to conduct something important. For maximum hierarchical effect, the finest chairs positioned to face the door, the fireplace at her back, the light from the east windows on the faces of whoever was entering rather than on her own. Cecily knew this room's geometry thoroughly. She had arranged it herself on many occasions. She stood at the door now, with the Earl beside her, and she watched Lady Ashmore register the composition of the doorway and change shape the way a person does when a room does not match what they had expected. "My lord," Lady Ashmore said. She looked at Cecily. The word she used in her gaze was not spoken aloud, but Cecily had heard it before. It was the word that said she was an arrangement, not a person. "Lady Ashmore," the Earl said, and his voice was very even, very quiet. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood before her, not seated, which meant she could not remain seated with dignity, and she rose, which was not what she had planned to do. "I must speak with you on a matter that requires adjustment to the arrangement we have discussed." Lady Ashmore looked at Cecily again. Then at the Earl. "Indeed," she said. "I intend to offer for Miss Vane," he said. The silence in the room was the kind that has physical weight. "Miss Vane," Lady Ashmore said, "is not a party to any arrangement." "She is now," he said. "I ask your blessing as the head of this household and as a courtesy, not as a permission. Miss Vane is not your ward, and she is of age." Georgiana, who had appeared in the doorway behind them, looked between the faces in the room with an expression of genuine interest, as though this were a puzzle she found unexpectedly engaging. She said nothing, which was wise. Lady Ashmore stood with her fan held at an angle that was very precise and very controlled. Cecily watched her work through it, watched the architecture of a woman whose script had simply encountered a room it had not accounted for. She was not without intelligence. She knew when a position could be held and when it could not. "The arrangement with respect to Georgiana," she said finally, "is not one I intend to honor," the Earl said. "I am sorry for any inconvenience. Georgiana will have her season. She will do very well. She does not need this particular arrangement." Georgiana from the doorway said, "I have always felt that, actually," and then thought better of adding to it, and was silent. Lady Ashmore looked at Cecily for a long time. Cecily looked back. She did not look away. She had spent 2 years making herself very small and very useful in this woman's house. And she understood that this was the last thing she would do in it, and she made herself stand straight. "She will need somewhere to stay," Lady Ashmore said at last, "while arrangements are made." "She will stay in my house in Bath," the Earl said, "under the care of my aunt, Lady Polstead, with every propriety observed, until the license is obtained." Lady Ashmore sat down. She picked up her fan. She did not open it. She said to Cecily, with the air of someone who has heard a word used incorrectly for a long time, and has just been given the correct term, "I suppose you were never going to be content with drafting letters." "I tried to be," Cecily said. "I was very nearly successful." There was a pause, and then, very briefly, something moved across Lady Ashmore's face that was not entirely unkind. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had managed a great many difficult transitions in her life, and was capable of managing one more. Agnes was found out the same afternoon, not by Cecily, who had no interest in the matter beyond wanting it understood, but by the housekeeper's assistant, who noticed the missing paper and mentioned it to Mrs. Platt, who mentioned it to Lady Ashmore. Agnes did not deny it. She had, she said, thought she was helping. She had seen the Earl's letter to Cecily. She had waited for a reply that did not come. She had decided, in the particular way of a 19-year-old who reads too many novels and means extremely well, that someone needed to say what Cecily could not make herself say, and that she was the right person to say it. Cecily, when she heard this account second-hand from Mrs. Platt, sat very quietly for a long moment. She thought about the letter on the pale blue paper. She thought about the sentence at its close that had made the back of her throat close. That she had thought of little else since his last visit. She thought about how a girl of 19 with a good heart and limited information had looked at a situation that 2 sensible adults were navigating with perfect correctness and had simply, with a pen and a borrowed sheet of paper, removed the obstacle. It was not the way Cecily would have done it. It was not, she thought, how anything ought to be done. And yet the letter had said, in handwriting that was almost but not quite her own, the exact truth. Agnes had known the truth and had said it, which was more than Cecily had managed in 7 months of knowing it herself. She did not know what to do with that. She set it aside to consider at a more convenient moment, which she suspected would never fully arrive. Lady Ashmore dismissed her from service with 2 months' wages, which was lenient, and a reference that did not mention the matter, which was generous. Cecily was not in the house when this was done, because she was in the library with him, sitting in the window seat where she had once noted a scar on his jaw and firmly put a book on the wrong shelf. "She meant well," Cecily said. "She did," he said. "It was a very strange way to help." "It brought you here," he said. "You brought you here," she said. "You came when you knew the letter was false. I came because I thought the letter might be false, and the feeling behind it might be true." He paused. Was it? She looked at the pale October light on the window and at her own hands in her lap, which had been very still all morning, and were very still now. The letter said, "I had thought of little else," she said. "Yes, that was true," she said. "I want you to know that I would have eventually arrived at telling you that myself. I was simply working up to it." "How long?" he said, with something in his voice that was almost amusement, which she thought was a significant event. "Were you planning to take?" "I had not established a firm timeline," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She looked at him. His face, so carefully controlled, had softened slightly at the edges, and it made him look, for a moment, the way she imagined he had looked before he had learned to be contained. She thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who had stopped permitting herself to think such things 2 years ago, that she would very much like to see him look that way again. The license arrived within the fortnight. Lady Polstead in Bath was a small, sharp-eyed woman with opinions about breakfast and an apparently inexhaustible supply of warmth toward people she had decided deserved it, and she decided Cecily deserved it with a speed that was slightly overwhelming. She installed Cecily in a room with a window that looked over the garden, and brought her tea without asking, and sat with her in the mornings when Cecily was writing letters, which she now wrote only for herself, to people who had been waiting to hear from her, rather than to people whose correspondence she managed. The difference in the weight of the pen was something she had not expected to notice. She noticed it considerably. Lady Polstead told her, once, with great directness, that Edmund had been a careful man for 3 years, and that he had been, in her estimation, extremely careful about Cecily in particular, which Lady Polstead considered a reliable indicator. She said this over tea, on a morning when the garden below was pale with November frost, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a settled fact. "He turned a portrait toward the wall," Cecily said. "He told you that?" "Yes." "That," Lady Polstead said, "is Edmund at his most forthcoming. You should take it as a declaration." Cecily thought about this. "I think I did," she said. The church in Bath where they married was small and cold, and had a view through the east window of bare plane trees against a November sky. The ceremony was attended by Lady Polstead, a cousin of Edmund's named Hartfield, who had kind eyes and muddy boots. Mrs. Platt, the housekeeper who had taken the post-chaise from Ashmore Park as a personal decision and would not hear of being dissuaded, and Georgiana Ashmore, who had written to Cecily 3 times since the drawing-room, and who arrived in a deep red pelisse and sat in the front pew, and wept happily and silently, from the first hymn to the final blessing. When the vicar asked whether anyone knew of any just cause or impediment, there was a very brief silence in which Cecily was aware of Edmund's hand around hers, warm and certain, and the cold light through the east window, and the bare trees moving slightly in the November air. No one spoke. She looked at him. He looked at her. His expression was the most open she had seen it. "No impediment," the vicar said, and continued. She signed her name differently afterward, at the register. It was a very small change. 3 letters instead of 4. A pen borrowed from the vicar's desk. She pressed the pen down carefully and wrote the new name with the attention she gave to everything that mattered. And she thought about a letter she had not written that had nevertheless told the truth, and about a man who had come anyway, and about the small, persistent courage of saying plainly what you had been thinking when someone simply asked. The morning of the 4th of November, 1814, was the sort of morning that kept its word. Edmund's house in the country outside Bath had a library with tall windows and a particular morning light, and a portrait in the east hall of a woman with a kind face that Cecily had asked about and been told about with more steadiness than she had expected, and which faced the room properly now, not toward the wall. There was a fire in the library hearth, and a desk that had seen corrected documents and was large enough for 2. There was, on the windowsill, a small volume of verse that she had been the last person to hold before setting it on the correct shelf, and which had arrived in a box of Edmund's books without comment, which she chose to read as one. She stood at the window and looked at the November garden, which had given up its roses and was very bare and very quiet and entirely itself. He came into the library and stood beside her, and they looked at the garden together without needing to arrange anything about it. She had, she thought, taken an extremely long time to arrive at a thing she had known for 7 months. The fire behind them kept its warmth. Outside, the first of the November frost was beginning to settle on the bare branches, and the world was very still. Thank you for staying to the end. If Cecily's long walk to plainness moved you, leave a word below about the moment that meant the most.